I'm Professor David Nutt, psychiatrist, neuropsychopharmacologist, and brain scientist. I'm here today to answer your questions from the internet. This is Psychedelic Therapy Support. This is from Sir Chutney. Apparently magic mushrooms help combat depression. Well, it's hard to feel sad when you're in a knife fight with Kermit the Frog. That's not anything any of our patients have described. But I think what you're getting to is the fact that there is a conception of prejudice, that psychedelics distort thinking so you are no longer depressed. Psychedelics for depression do not work simply by giving people a good time. That's what critics say. They say, oh, well, of course. You give people a really happy trip and they come out of it. They're not depressed anymore because they've had fun, and then their depression will come back. The truth is, most of our patients, whether it's depression or anorexia or PTSD, the trips are very challenging because they are having to deal with the consequences and the reality of their mental illness. So it's actually quite insensitive to imply that they're just getting off their heads and having fun and getting better, because they're not. They're working through often very deep trauma. But the second thing to say is that the process of changing your experience of yourself during the trip and the plasticity which comes as a result of the psychedelic, they put people into a much better place so they can then use cognitive processes, psychotherapeutic processes, to then lay down new ways of thinking about their past and new plans for the future. And that's where the long-term therapeutic benefits comes from. This is from Foxy Troxy. How well understood are the effects of psychedelics on the brain and consciousness? The key feature of the state is that the brain becomes much more integrated. Parts of the brain which haven't connected before become connected. And that is why people have profound insights often. But also afterwards, there's an enduring impact on learning and memory we call neuroplasticity. And that is probably responsible for the very long-term benefits and insights that psychedelics produce. The most remarkable surprise from our research with psychedelics was the fact that they switch off parts of the brain rather than switch them on, which regulate what we see and how we see and how we think and how we feel. And that then lets the brain reorganize itself in a way which is normally not allowed. This one is from Chance Impact 2425. Psychedelics do cause psychosis, right? And the answer is wrong. There is no evidence in the modern era where we have nearly 20 years of experimental studies with psychedelics. However, if you have a vulnerability to psychosis, if you are psychotic, psychedelics can destabilize you, so they can make psychosis different and sometimes worse. This is from Crazy Horse Rider. What to do when you're overwhelmed by the experience? If the trip is becoming very disturbing and causing anxiety and fear, then you need to have prepared an exit strategy. So the first thing to say is that you should never trip unless there's someone with you who is not tripping, who can talk you down, who can reassure you, ground you in the reality that you're actually still you and you're still where you are and you're still alive, and you're not have been morphed into some atom in another universe. This question is from Bouncy Beach. Change my view. The experiences of someone who has had a psychedelic trip are no more valid than a person with psychosis hallucinations. I'm afraid, Bouncy Beach, you are wrong for a number of reasons. The main one is that people with psychosis hallucinations end up being very disturbed by them and actually often acting out on them and harming themselves or other people. That doesn't happen with psychedelic hallucinations. But the more important difference is that people with psychosis have beliefs which are fixed and usually wrong. They may think that a neighbor is poisoning them or that a friend is harming them in some way. Psychedelics do exactly the opposite. They actually make people more understanding of themselves and of the external world. But I want to say one other thing, and this is also very important. We now know from at least 7 studies that have looked at this, that the hallucinations of psychedelics do not correlate with the positive changes in mood and attitude and behavior. So they're incidental. What's critical to the benefit of psychedelics is people getting insights, getting a sense of being more than they were. Those powerful subjective experiences, not the hallucinations, predict good outcome. So this question is from Highly Affected. My therapist keeps telling me about the advances of psychedelics to treat complex PTSD. And I'm starting to think she may be implying something. There is definitely some evidence that psychedelics can help with PTSD. There is also some evidence that another drug called MDMA, that can also be useful in complex PTSD. And also really critical to say that the best outcomes come from having therapy between the sessions, i.e. after the trips. I've recently seen data from the new group of patients who are being treated in Australia. Australia 2 years ago made MDMA and psilocybin available for therapy. And MDMA was specifically indicated for treatment-resistant PTSD. And there's a colleague of mine, Professor Gunawardene in Sydney, who's now done over 40 people with chronic complex PTSD with MDMA, and the results are rather spectacular. So from MDMA therapy, what exactly happens during an MDMA-assisted therapy session? The way we engage with these sessions is to prepare the patients as to what they're going to experience. And they will often experience the coming up phase. They might feel a bit of the heart pounding. They might feel a bit of anxiety. We reassure them that we're measuring their blood pressure, no harm is going to come to them. But the key is when the drug starts to change the brain. And what we say is, go where you need to go. Use the effect of the MDMA to allow you to deal with the things that traumatize you. Go back to the bomb in Iraq. Go back to the road traffic accident. Go back to you perhaps being traumatized through rape or assault. Go back to those situations, and then we will be with you. We will support you through reliving those experiences, which will be unpleasant. Now, the way MDMA works is to allow people to re-engage with the memory without the emotion that comes back with the memory overwhelming them. This is Dogwater 79. MDMA worsened my depression. Am I an alien? Never done any studies on MDMA and aliens, so I can't comment on that. It's not impossible that MDMA could worsen your depression. We know that if you use a lot of MDMA and you do a lot of other things when you're taking it, if you dance for hours and hours and hours and exhaust yourself, you get very disruptive sleep for a few days. Yes, MDMA can produce low mood. That was actually one of the arguments that was used to try to justify the banning of MDMA, because people said, well, this is a form of brain damage. In fact, ridiculous studies were done where animals were poisoned with enormous doses of MDMA. And yes, it will cause brain damage. And in our MDMA study, we looked very carefully at this. We took people who had quite severe alcohol dependence. We gave them 2 MDMA trips. And after each one, we looked very carefully at whether there was a negative impact on their mood. And there wasn't. In fact, there was a positive impact on their mood, because MDMA in a therapeutic session, though challenging, can also lead to improvements in mood and insight. So we can say, if it's done right, MDMA doesn't cause depression. This is from Klotsak. How does ketamine therapy work? Do you actually have to live through your trauma again? And the answer is that you don't. So ketamine therapy disrupts your thinking. And for some people, that's just good enough. That gets rid of the thinking about the trauma. It just cuts it. But for other people, the trauma may come to the fore and you may have to work through it. So we cannot predict. What happens for most people is that there's that period of 2 or 3 days after the ketamine where they're much more able to think rationally about the past, the present, and the future. And that also helps them if they need to deal with the trauma. But you don't have to relive the trauma. It's not the same really as using MDMA for PTSD, where re-engaging with the trauma is quite critical to the benefit. This is from GirlBrain69. Cancelling this week's therapy appointment because I sorted out my inner child healing in a K-hole. The K-hole is a term that's used by people who take ketamine where they get into a state where they're completely dissociated. It's definitely happened upon something we're using a lot. Because ketamine is easier to work with, because it's a medicine, even though it's an illegal medicine recreationally, we and others are using ketamine as an alternative to psilocybin or other psychedelics for therapy. But we're using it as a way of changing the way people think about their problems to facilitate therapy. So we, in our current studies, are doing 3, 4, or 5 ketamine sessions, usually 1 or 2 weeks apart, with therapy in between. And we're getting outcomes there which are pretty similar to what we get from a single psilocybin treatment. So ketamine produces changes in the brain similar to psilocybin, but not as long-lasting. And that's why you need repeated doses to build up to get the same size effect. So this is from the Therapeutic Ketamine subreddit. Having my first ketamine infusion, what to expect? You will feel possibly a bit of flushing to start with. Maybe your heart pounds a little. And then you'll go into a state where the world doesn't seem quite so real. Your vision will start to distort a bit. Your sense of control of your eyes and your body will start to become a bit disrupted. No one can predict what their brain is going to go into under ketamine. But that state is transient. Ideally, you use it if it takes you somewhere interesting where you can grapple with a problem you've had in the past or you're having in present. But afterwards, with ketamine, your brain is much more tranquil, and you can then, with your therapist, work on the insights that you have gained during the therapy and build them up and start using them to develop new strategies for dealing with how you feel, how you relate, how you deal with the future. So this one's from Kimberly Munthy Bailey. Okay, Trump signs executive order to loosen restrictions on psychedelic drugs. And what the fuck does that really mean? I think it's actually a very positive move, and it's positive for two reasons. I mean, these drugs are still illegal, so that makes research with them very, very difficult. Each study takes 2 years to get permissions. Despite the fact we've done loads of them, we're still treated as if we're using a really dangerous drug in patients. And that means that the research has been very, very slow. So I'm hoping this executive order will accelerate access and reduce the costs so more studies can be done, and we will get to clinical trials being finished and reported much more cost effectively. This is from @MRC Olek. Crazy how nobody talks about Ibogaine therapy. The magic that it works on the brain is nothing less than a miracle. Well, I don't disagree. Ibogaine is atypical in the sense that it doesn't work through the serotonin system as obviously as, say, psilocybin or LSD. It's atypical in the effects are very, very odd and very long lasting. Often people are in a kind of tripped out state for several days. Many people describe it as the most powerful, disturbing experience of their life. One thing I can say is that people don't get addicted to Ibogaine. It's not very pleasant. But it is very powerful, and that is one of the reasons why it's been used in perhaps the most difficult of all disorders to treat, which is addiction. And there is reasonable evidence that Ibogaine can help break the thinking patterns, the craving patterns, the behavioral patterns of addiction. The problem with Ibogaine is that it can cause heart irregularities. And worldwide, there have been over 30 deaths from people using Ibogaine. We're now recommending that anyone who's having Ibogaine therapy at least does it in a clinic where there's a cardiologist who can deal with any cardiac arrhythmias, irregularities if they occur. So this is Bryan Johnson, who says he's live streaming 5-MeO-DMT this weekend. What should I expect? So 5-MeO-DMT is more usually known as toad. This is very similar to DMT. It was first found in the exudates of the skin on the Sonora Desert toad. It has an effect which is somewhat different from DMT. It's more powerful. A lot of people say it's 10 times more powerful than DMT. It puts you into a state where you really don't know where you are. People often describe it's either complete blackness or complete whiteness. They're often unaware of what they're doing, and we've just completed a study of 5-MeO-DMT, trying to image it. Very difficult to image it because people were screaming, shouting, running around in a very dissociated state. We think that's because the pharmacology is half a psychedelic, but it also has some other actions which we think may change the brain experience. So the next question is from Bohem. What are your opinions on the future of psychedelics in the medical field? We already know that psychedelics can have powerful effects in some disorders, particularly like cluster headaches. Cluster headaches are the most extreme form of headache. They're associated with high rates of suicide, and psychedelics can put cluster headaches to bed. Another area of considerable research interest at present is, can psychedelics help heal the brain, which has been traumatized? One of the things we know is that they increase the growth of neurons and synapses, and there are preclinical studies showing they can accelerate recovery from stroke. So currently a study is going on where people are given intravenous infusion at a sub-psychedelic level of DMT, dimethyltryptamine, to see if we can accelerate recovery from stroke by inducing this growth of neurons, this phenomenon we call neuroplasticity. And then there are also other disorders, there are neurodevelopmental disorders, where people often discover that psychedelics have helped them. I think the best example of someone with a sort of little neurological condition benefiting from a psychedelic actually is Paul Stamets. When he was young, he had a stammer, and he took magic mushrooms and the stammer went away. And that makes perfect sense because we know that stammering is due to a failure of communication between two sides of the brain. And magic mushrooms increase connectivity across the brain, so almost certainly cured his stammer by increasing that connectivity. So this is from Ayah 2121. Ayahuasca is not 10 years of therapy in one night. And I hope this idea stops being marketed. So ayahuasca is a drinkable form of DMT, dimethyltryptamine. It's a cocktail of two herbs, one which contains the psychedelic DMT, and the other which contains a substance called harmaline. Harmaline prevents the breakdown of DMT by the gut and the liver. Ayahuasca has been used for thousands of years by indigenous peoples in the Amazon basin as part of religious and developmental and cultural experiences, usually in group therapy, usually overnight, usually with music. The processes are curated by curanderos or shamans. It's very powerful. For many people, ayahuasca can be a life-changing experience. The experience itself is very powerful, but when it's used as a therapy, yes, 1 or 2 ayahuasca overnights can cause profound benefits in people with traumas, veterans, even with addiction. That's all for today. Thanks for watching Psychedelic Therapy Support. And if you want to learn more, feel free to read the book called Psychedelics by me, Professor David Nutt.